Your Majesty, they're all staring.
Let them.
You're safe now. You don't need me.
That's the problem.
Problem?
I don't need you anymore.
That sounds reassuring.
I want you. Queens don't surrender what they want.
Chapter 1. The Signal. The alarms had been screaming for 6 minutes when I finally understood I was going to die. Not in a distant, philosophical way, the kind that comes with a countdown. Oxygen at 11%. The ship voice announcing it in the same flat, patient tone it used to report weather conditions, as if the end of my life warranted no special treatment. My name is Vesa Threen. 3 days ago, I was crowned Queen of the Ashkari people. Today I was dying alone, in the dark, 20 years old, in a ship that was venting oxygen through a hull fracture I could hear hissing behind the wall panels. My escort fleet was gone, 3 ships burning outside the cracked viewport. Gone like they had never existed. My guards had turned on me, not the political architects of the coup. My guards, people I had known since I was 6 years old, who had tasted my food before I ate it, who had stood at the back of every lesson I ever had. They raised their weapons and fired, because someone had given an order, and they chose that order over the oath they had made before my father. The Regency Council called it a correction, as if I were an arithmetical error. The Ashkari debt system was born during the extinction years, when trade agreements were the only things keeping our colonies alive. Nothing given freely, nothing received without account. A debt unpaid will eventually destroy you. This was the first lesson any Ashkari child learned before they learned to read or count or walk a palace corridor without stumbling. I tried the comms one more time. Static answered, the same as every time before. My homeworld was too far. Allied ships that should have been in range were silent, because they had already calculated which side offered better return. Trade favors, old debts, cold calculations made in comfortable rooms. Every promise made at every diplomatic table, over 14 years, had been quietly weighed. None of it had come out in my favor. Then a voice broke through the static, rough, unhurried, entirely human. This is the gray tide responding to your distress signal. You have maybe 10 minutes of air left by my read. Hang tight. I stared at the comm unit. My people did not call on humans. We tolerated their trade routes, acknowledged them as a species, and found them too unpredictable to respect. And yet one of them was already adjusting his course toward mine. Dale Osai, independent hauler. 3 systems over stripping scrap off an old mining rig when my signal reached his board. He knew what I was. The frequency stamp made that clear. He knew, and his ship was already turning. You should not approach, I warned him. There may be pursuers. There is always pursuers, he said, like this was something he said often. Buckle in. This is going to get rough before it gets better. His ship appeared on my console as a small, dense shape cutting through my fleet's wreckage. Mismatched, plating-covered repairs that covered older repairs. It moved with aggressive precision no salvage hauler should have managed, weaving between burning hull sections with the confidence of someone who had been flying through things that could kill him for a very long time. I could hear him through the open channel, talking to himself. Come on, a few more seconds. Do not fail me now. The airlock hissed. I went through it on legs that had mostly stopped cooperating. The air on his side hit me like something physical. Oil, metal, the faint sharpness of engine coolant. I breathed it in. Great desperate pulls of it, because it was the most valuable thing I had ever been given, and I was not going to waste it being graceful. Easy, said a voice. A hand caught my arm. You are safe. Breathe slow. He was younger than his voice suggested. Dark-skinned, close-cut hair, an angular face with lines around the eyes from years of squinting at viewports in poor light. His jacket was more patched than original fabric. His hands were stained with grease that had worked itself permanently into his skin. He guided me to a bench bolted against the wall and held on until he was sure I was not going to fall. I knew someone was dying out there, he said simply. That was enough. I searched his face for the hidden clause, the deferred negotiation, the price that would emerge later when I had fewer options. I found nothing. Among my people, no one moves without calculation. Every act of help is a transaction waiting to complete. Dale Osai seemed to have entirely missed that lesson and seemed completely unbothered by the gap. We need to move, he said, back at the controls. Whoever hit your fleet will check the wreck. Then the proximity alarm went off. 3 signatures appeared on the console. Sleek, fast, built for pursuit. I recognized the design before the identification finished. Coup ships, my own people's vessels, now hunting me through the wreckage of everything they had just destroyed. Friends of yours? Dale asked. They want me dead so the crown passes to someone easier to control, I said. He did not pause to weigh the risk or calculate what this meant for him. He dropped into the pilot's seat, strapped in with practiced speed, and his hands went to the controls. Then let us give them a reason to regret finding you, he said. And the engines went from a quiet hum to something that vibrated in my back teeth. The gray tide was not built for combat. But Dale did not fly it like a cargo hauler. He flew it like a knife, small and fast and committed, threading through the wreckage of my escort fleet with a precision that seemed impossible from inside the ship. The pursuing vessels were faster in open space. In here, in the maze he had already mapped in the seconds before the alarm, they could not catch him. You are insane, I told him, gripping the seat until my fingers ached. Probably, he agreed, and there was a grin in his voice, despite everything happening around us. But insane keeps you alive out here. 2 shots grazed the hull. Warning lights lit every panel. Dale did not slow down. He leaned into the chaos, using the debris field as a shield rather than an obstacle. His hands never shook. Why are you doing this? I asked, the words coming out before I decided to say them. You do not know me. You owe me nothing. By any accounting of your own interests, you should hand me over for whatever reward they are offering. His jaw tightened, just slightly. He did not look away from the controls. Where I come from, he said, you do not leave someone to die just because helping them is inconvenient. The debris field opened into clear space. The pursuing ships fell back, caught in the wreckage they had not been willing to follow us into as deeply as Dale had. He pushed the engines past their limits and aimed for an asteroid belt 2 sectors over, enough mineral interference to scramble their sensors. We get there, we get time to think. For the first time since the attack began, I exhaled. The belt closed around us. Dale eased back the engines, and the ship went quiet. He rolled his shoulders, exhaled once. Then he looked at his display and went very still. He traced several contacts with one finger, following their pattern. These ships are not searching, he said quietly. They are covering exits. Every route out of this belt has a ship positioned at the edge of sensor range. Voss did not come to chase us. He came to herd us. Herd us toward what? I asked. Toward whatever end he has already arranged, Dale said. Someone planned every exit route before the attack even happened. This was coordinated well in advance. He looked at me. We are not going to run our way out of this. Whatever we do next has to change the shape of the problem entirely. He said it without panic. That was the thing about Dale Osai. He was never panicking. He was always just thinking. 3 hours earlier, aboard the Council flagship, Regent Morrow watched the coup unfold from her own display, with the focused calm of someone who had run through every possible outcome enough times that the actual event felt like confirmation rather than surprise. She was 62 years old. She had served the Ishkari throne for 35 of those years. She had helped hold the kingdom together through 2 succession crises before this one. She told herself, again, that this time was no different. She was not doing this for power. She had plenty of that already. She was doing it because she could see what was approaching from outside Ashkari borders. 3 expanding empires repositioning their assets. Trade networks shifting away from Ashkari routes. The kingdom was not ready for what was coming, and its new queen was 20 years old, still grieving, and had refused every piece of strategic counsel Morrow had offered in the weeks since the coronation. So Morrow had made a different kind of decision. Commander Voss entered her operations room. She is still alive, he said. Our ships lost her in the debris field. She may have received assistance from a human hauler. Morrow turned from the display. She was always going to survive the first attempt, she said. She is her father's daughter. Voss was quiet for a moment. She is 20, Regent, he said. I know how old she is, Morrow said. I was there when she was born. That is not the same as being ready for what is coming, Morrow said. The people who pay for that unreadiness are not the queen. They are the ordinary citizens who trust that whoever sits on that throne can actually protect them. She met Voss's eyes. I made my decision. Now I need you to make yours. His expression was not agreement. It was the look of a man choosing to follow an order he intended to examine more carefully later. He nodded and left. Back in the asteroid belt, Dale had already opened the rear storage compartments and was pulling out components I did not recognize. laying them on the workbench with the methodical focus he applied to everything. "Tell me about Morrow," he said without looking up. "Everything from the beginning." I watched him sort components while I talked. Morrow had been my father's chief advisor for 2 decades, the most capable political mind I had ever watched work. I had trusted her the way you trust a wall, without thinking carefully about whether the foundation was sound. "She turned against you because she thinks she knows better," Dale said. "It was not a question. If she just wanted power, she would have found a way to control you instead of removing you," he said. "People who are willing to destroy something usually believe they have a good reason. The dangerous ones actually believe they are right." He looked up briefly. "She genuinely believes she is right, and that is a harder problem than simple ambition." I straightened in my seat and extended my signet ring to him with both hands, palms up the traditional way. "The right of life debt," I said. "Among my people, when someone saves your life, especially a crown-bearer's life, a formal debt must be acknowledged and repaid. This ring is the appropriate symbol of that acknowledgement. Please accept it so the right can be considered complete and the obligation properly closed." He looked at the ring, then at me. "I do not want your ring," he said. "It is not a gift," I said. "It is payment, a formal symbol of what I owe you." Vesas," he said, using my name without title in a way that startled me more than it should have. "I did not pull you out of that wreck to get paid. Put the ring away." His voice was not unkind. It was simply final in a way I did not have a framework for arguing against. He returned with a thin blanket and a ration bar and set both beside me without ceremony, the way you set a glass of water on a table for someone you are with. Nothing significant about it, no expectation of a response. "Eat something," he said. "You look like you have not eaten in a while." I picked up the ration bar. "Every kindness I have ever received," I said quietly, "came with a cost attached. I do not know what to do with kindness that asks for nothing." Something shifted in his expression. Chapter 2. Old Metal. "Where I come from," he said, "kindness is not supposed to come with a price tag. But the ones worth knowing try to." He went back to his work. I unwrapped the ration bar and ate it slowly. It tasted like compressed grain and nothing memorable. It was the best thing I had eaten in 3 days, which said more about the last 3 days than about the ration bar. I did not sleep. I told myself it was the unfamiliarity of the ship, the hum of the engines, the occasional creak from the hull. That was true. The more honest reason was that closing my eyes meant the last 3 days came in loud and close, and I was not ready to be alone with that yet. So I sat near the small viewport and watched the asteroids drift past and listened to Dale work. He moved around the ship the way someone moves when they are trying not to wake a person who is sleeping. Tools came out of places that were not officially tool storage. He traced a cable along the wall with 2 fingers, testing for heat, found something he did not like near a junction box, and spent an hour on a repair that involved more patience than technique. He worked the way water works on stone, not fast, not dramatic, just consistent. "How long since you actually slept?" he asked, not looking up from the cable junction. "Before the coronation," I said. "The night before." He did the math without commenting on it. "There is a bunk in the back," he said. "Nothing fancy but horizontal and off the floor, which is most of what sleeping requires." "I know," I said. "I am not ready yet." He accepted that and went back to work. Among my people, an admission like that would have been noted and stored. "What was the colony like?" I asked eventually. He paused with a tool in his hand, deciding whether to answer. "Small," he said finally. "Rock mining, mostly. A company operation, about 800 people at peak. And when the company left, declared bankruptcy and cut the facilities loose without warning," he said. "No severance, no transport arranged. Just a notice that payroll would stop processing in 72 hours. He said it without anger, a fact about the world, absorbed and filed. "My mother was in the group that tried to keep the community functioning," he said. "She gave away more than we could afford. I used to argue with her about it. We had enough, not surplus, but enough. And she would look at the family down the corridor who had less and take some of ours and give it to them. I was 14, and it scared me. What happens when we run out? What happens when we need that and we have already given it away?" She told me that if the person down the corridor did not make it through the winter, I would spend the rest of my life knowing I had enough to help and chose not to. She said she could live with being hungry. She could not live with being the kind of person who watched someone else go hungry when she had something to give. He checked the seal on the junction box. She was very certain about that one thing. Most other things she would reconsider. Not that. She taught you that kindness is a choice about who you want to be, I said.
Not about what you can afford.
He glanced at me.
She put it better than that.
But yes, I turned that over, in my mind. Every tutor I had ever had described kindness as a strategic tool, something you deployed when it served a purpose and withheld when it did not. This was a different framework entirely, and I had no experience with it.
I thought about every council session I had ever attended, the way members had positioned themselves physically toward whoever held the most current favor,
The way agreements were made in layers, with the real terms discussed in smaller rooms before the formal one. I had understood it as politics. I was beginning to understand it was something else. It was a system built on the assumption that nobody would help without a reason, and therefore everyone spent all their energy managing the reasons. It was very efficient. It was also completely exhausting, and I was tired of it. I was taught that generosity without calculation is weakness, I said. That anything given without expectation of return is something lost. Every lesson in statecraft said the same thing in different words. Kindness is a tool. Account for everything. He set a tool down and leaned against the wall. That sounds exhausting, he said. It is, I admitted. It is exhausting to live inside a world where every gesture has a calculation beneath it. He said nothing. He did not have to. Power built on people being afraid to take it from you is different from power people actually want you to have, he said. The first kind falls apart fast once someone stops being scared. I sat with that for a long while. I thought about the council members who had smiled at my coronation. I had watched those smiles and tried to read them the way I had been trained to read everything. I had been looking for the wrong thing entirely. The alarm woke me 2 hours later. I had not meant to sleep. I had closed my eyes for what felt like a moment, and then Dale was already at the controls, expression tight with a focus that looked like calm but was not. They found us, he said without turning, faster than expected. Someone out there is very good at their job. On the console, 3 signatures had become 5, positioned to cut off the most obvious exits from the belt. Talk to me, Dale said, eyes on the display. Who is Commander Voss? He commanded my father's honor guard for 9 years, I said, buckling in with hands that shook. He was the one who read the formal charges against me before the council voted. If he is here personally, the coup considers me dangerous enough for his direct attention. Does he quit? Dale asked. No, I said, he does not. Good to know, Dale said, and pulled the ship into a hard turn. What Dale did in the next 12 minutes was something I could not fully describe from inside it. He flew the asteroid belt, the way someone navigates a building they designed themselves, threading between massive rocks with a precision that was not only skill but memory. He had spent the quiet hours before the alarm cataloging the debris movement patterns, and now he used every observation. In the dense field, patience was worth more than speed. Dale had infinite patience for the right kind of problem. There, Dale said, pointing at the display. Old mining platform, abandoned. The mineral mass will blend our signature into the background. They cannot separate our reading from the scrap. The gap in the platform's outer frame that he was aiming for was narrow, significantly narrower than the gray tide looked like it should fit through. Dale, I started. I know, he said. Hold on. I pressed back into my seat and stopped breathing entirely. The hull groaned on both sides simultaneously as we scraped through clearance measured in fractions of a meter, and twisted metal beams scraped a sound down the exterior that I felt in my back teeth. Then we were through, into a wide, dark chamber surrounded by the silent shapes of abandoned machinery. Dale killed the engines and the lights and powered down everything except life support. We drifted in darkness and silence, and on the passive display I watched the pursuing ships approach the platform exterior and begin to circle. Neither of us spoke. I watched the signatures and counted my heartbeats and thought about Commander Voss, systematic and patient, working through the probability of where we had gone. He would not panic. He would not rush. He was the kind of officer who trusted his process and simply kept running it until it produced an answer. The 3 signatures circled for what felt like much longer than it was. Then, slowly, they began to move outward. Dale released a slow breath. That worked, I said quietly, because saying it aloud felt necessary. For now, he said. Voss will complete the pattern and come back to check what he missed. We have a few hours. He turned from the display and looked at me with the expression of someone who has just finished one problem and is ready to begin the next. Military communications in this region pass through relay points to maintain range, he said. Those relays are close enough that we can listen in from here. If Morrow gave Voss his assassination order directly, there will be a record in the traffic, he said. Something that ties her specifically to the unlawful order. If we find that, we have something that cannot be dismissed as fabricated. He started pulling components from the storage compartments. This is scrap, I said. I know, he said. It still works. Your people throw away equipment when it shows age. Old equipment that still functions has already solved its problems. Newer just means someone replaced something before understanding what was wrong. The interception array took 4 hours to assemble. During that time, the pursuing ships made 2 more passes of the platform exterior, and each time I tracked them on the passive display and held completely still. Dale worked without stopping, explaining what he was doing in pieces because talking through it helped him maintain focus. When the array was ready, we waited. The first transmissions were administrative noise. Then a frequency came through, distinct and clean, that Dale flagged with a slight shift of his jaw. I recognized the voice before he had finished isolating it. I had sat across tables from Morrow in council sessions for 20 years. That measured rhythm, each syllable placed with the precision of someone who has already thought through everything she is about to say, was unmistakable. She was speaking to Commander Voss. What she said left no room for interpretation. The Queen was not to survive. She named me.
She described the acceptable methods.
She spoke in the flat administrative language of someone who has decided that what they are doing is a logistical problem rather than a moral one. The recording was 4 minutes long. When it ended, neither Dale nor I said anything for a moment. She told me my father would be proud of me, I said. The day after my coronation. She said it to my face. Dale was quiet. People who do things like this usually find ways to keep believing they are on the right side, he said. Easier than looking directly at what they are actually doing. He said it without venom, just observation. He set the device down. Then he held up one hand. There is a second segment. Listen. I had known Morrow's voice my entire life. I had heard it in comfort and correction and formal ceremony, and the quiet discussions I had overheard through closed doors at the edge of my childhood. It had been, for as long as I could remember, a constant in the world I knew. Now I had it on a recording, saying words I would have to use to take apart everything she had built. And the voice in the recording was exactly the same as the one I had always known. That was the part I was not prepared for. He made a final connection and checked the reading. There, he said, it is not elegant, but it will do the job it is meant to do. In the palace, tools were often evaluated on whether they looked like they were doing the job. The appearance of efficiency mattered as much as efficiency itself. Dale's tool looked like what it was, a salvage technician's improvised solution in a difficult situation. It would work better than anything more polished would have, and it would ask no credit for that. Morrow's voice again, speaking to someone whose response we could not hear. The recording alone will not be enough, she said. If it surfaces, the source will be questioned. So we ensure there is something at stake that makes refusing our terms more costly than accepting them. Something personal. Something she cannot walk away from. Dale played it back again, then set the device down. She planned for the recording being found, he said. She has a contingency, and she has not told Voss what it is. She genuinely believes this is right, I said. The thought arrived with the particular weight of things you know to be true, but have been avoiding confirming.
Every part of her voice in that recording was the voice of someone who has made peace with what they are doing.
Not hidden guilt, not suppressed doubt, just decision. The kind that comes from having run through the alternatives enough times that you have convinced yourself there are none. Dale was quiet. Yes, he said. That is what I have been trying to tell you. It changes what we need to prepare for. Before either of us could say more, the passive display picked up a new signature. Not circling, not searching. Stationary, parked at the main exit route, engine output low but consistent. He has been out there this entire time, Dale said quietly. Not searching, waiting. Voss already knew where we were. He had positioned himself at the only viable exit and was simply waiting for us to use it. All that patience, infinite patience, and all of it aimed at the one door we needed. Voss had infinite patience because he trusted his method completely, I said. He picked the most likely exit and he is waiting. He does not need to find us. He only needs to be there when we try to leave. Dale studied the display for a long moment, which means we need to leave when he is not expecting us to leave, he said, and we need to go somewhere he has not accounted for in his plan. I looked at the display. He is expecting us to run, I said. We are not going to run, not anymore. Chapter 3. 3 days. We found the escape gap by watching Voss's pattern for 2 hours, mapping it until Dale found the brief window where 2 ship sensor ranges did not quite overlap. When he found it, he moved immediately. No discussion, no second guessing. He had done the analysis. He trusted the analysis. We cleared the belt 17 minutes later, and Dale pushed us toward the first jump point. The asteroid belt fell away behind us. For the first time, we were moving toward something rather than away from it. Only when we were 2 jumps out did he ease back the throttle. He ran a diagnostic on everything the chase and the hull scrape had stressed. 3 minor integrity issues. A coolant relay running warm. The starboard stabilizer needed recalibrating. He went through each item methodically, fixing what could be fixed now and marking what would wait. I watched him and tried to understand the ship by watching him interact with it, learning its language through his hands. You never stop, I said. Nothing on this ship fixes itself, he said. It is moving right now, putting stress on every system. If the stabilizer throws a warning while I am asleep and I am not there to catch it, we lose maneuverability at exactly the moment we most likely need it. Resting is for when the ship is resting.
Until then, it is just maintenance with a time limit. Among my people, those who kept things running and those who made decisions were strictly separated. I was beginning to think that was a mistake.
We talked more during those 3 days than I had talked honestly to another person in years. Among the Ashkari, conversation at the level of court carried its own protocols. Every exchange was understood to have implications beyond the words themselves. You said what served your position. You listened for what revealed theirs. The idea of speaking plainly with nothing to gain or protect was so foreign to how I had been shaped that the first few genuine exchanges felt like something had gone wrong. Nothing had gone wrong. Tell me how the debt system started, I said on the second morning. Not the official history, the actual one. He looked up from a coolant junction. You are asking the wrong person, he said. But you can tell me what you know. I told him instead, because I knew, and because telling him helped me understand what I had been circling around for 2 days. The debt system was a survival tool. It was born in the extinction years, when every tracked exchange was a life maintained. We built a civilization on that principle. And then we forgot why we built it that way. The thing about rules that were born from genuine emergency, I said, is that they become invisible once the emergency ends. They are just the way things are. You stop teaching their origin and start teaching them as permanent truth. By the time I was learning court protocol, nobody explained that we tracked every exchange because a generation ago an untracked gift in a supply shortage was a gift someone could not recover if they needed it back. They just taught me that this is how Ashkari people behave, as if it were nature rather than policy. And so you confused the tool for the culture, Dale said. I did, I said. Everyone I knew did. The people who built the tool were trying to survive. The people who inherited it were trying to be civilized. They are not the same project. He turned back to his work. The other thing about rules born from emergency, he said, is that they are very good at surviving the emergency that made them, and very bad at knowing when to change. I thought about Morrow, who was very good at following rules, and about what she was about to lose for it. Do you regret answering my signal? I asked on the second day. He was eating at the workbench that doubled as a dining table. No, he said, even knowing what it has cost you. The time, the danger, the work you have missed. No, he said again, like it was not a complicated question. If I had not answered and you had died out there, I would have known for the rest of my life that I was close enough to help and chose not to. That would have cost me more than anything this has cost me. So the Ashkari became very good at maintaining systems and forgot how to question them. Every culture does that, he said. The systems that keep you alive feel like truth because the cost of being wrong about them is too high to test. You do not experiment with what feeds you. You just keep doing it. The problem comes when the conditions change and the system has not been allowed to change with them. Because by then, questioning it feels like threatening survival. Even if not questioning it is the actual threat. I do not think you have a framework for that kind of accounting, he said. But it is a real one. I sat with that. I have spent my entire life, I said slowly, confusing obligation with kindness, believing that a gesture of goodwill only had value if it was properly repaid, that its worth was determined by what it generated in return. And now, Dale asked. I looked at the recording device on the shelf above the console.
Now, I am beginning to understand that maybe its value exists completely independent of any return.
Is that what Morrow is doing? I asked. Partly, Dale said. She is protecting a system she believes is the only thing standing between the Ashkari and what is coming from outside. She is not wrong that the system matters. She is wrong that it cannot survive being questioned. And she is wrong that you are the thing threatening it. He looked at me. You are the person who might actually update it. Which is probably why she moved when she did. People who are committed to maintaining a system tend to move against the person who might make the system no longer necessary. What do you actually want? He asked the next morning. Not what you need, not what you believe your position requires. What do you personally want? I stared at him. The question had a shape I was not used to navigating. I want things to be different, I said finally. I want a council that argues with me because they think I am wrong, not because they are positioning for advantage. I want people who are loyal because they choose to be. I want to go home and have people there genuinely glad. Those are wants, he said. Good. Now we are getting somewhere. There is a word that does not translate exactly into our language, I said. I have been trying to find the Ashkari equivalent for 2 days, and I cannot. What is the word? He asked. Gratitude, I said. We have a word for acknowledgement of received value, but that is not the same thing. Gratitude is not about what someone gave you, he said. It is about who gave it and why. The acknowledgement is almost incidental. Then we do not have a word for it, I said. At least not in the way you mean it. Can you feel it? He asked. Even without a word for it. I thought about the ration bar, the blanket, the way he had stayed up through the night on a repair that only mattered because I was still alive. I think I can, I said. I just do not know what to do with it. You do not have to do anything with it, he said. That is the difference. Debt requires a response. Gratitude just requires you to know what it is you feel. I looked out the viewport. That is a very significant difference, I said. Most of the important ones are, he said. What she was doing was standing in the palace that was supposed to be mine. Reviewing intelligence reports with the focused attention of someone who had prepared for every contingency and was simply confirming they were all still in place. The palace was secure. The succession artifacts were under guard. The ceremonial chambers were ready. 3 trusted council members were positioned. Everything was in order. Everything except the queen, who was still alive and had apparently found help from an unexpected source. Morrow made a note and moved to the next report. Voss entered her office.
The Judiciary Archive is reporting increased communication traffic, he said. Someone may be moving to submit formal evidence request. How long? Morrow asked. Hours, maybe less.
She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, execute the contingency. Voss went very still. Regent, the contingency involves detaining members of the palace household. People who have served this crown for decades, who had nothing to do with any of this. I know that, Morrow said, and I am genuinely sorry for it. But they will not be harmed if Vesa Threne does what she should have done at the beginning. And formally steps aside, Morrow said. She set the report down. The external threats I have been warning about for 2 years are still out there. They do not care about our internal politics. They will not wait while we resolve this cleanly. And a 20-year-old queen who has been on the throne for 3 days is not equipped to manage what is coming. I am. I have 35 years of managing what is coming. That is a significant thing to figure out, he said. I had good material to work from, I said. He almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. The ship hummed steadily around us, carrying us through the dark between stars at a speed that felt deliberately unhurried. I looked out at light that had left its source long before either of us existed and was only just arriving here, and thought about a woman named Morrow who was still convinced she was right and was somewhere ahead of us planning what happened next. Voss looked at the window behind her. This is not what I agreed to, he said. No, Morrow said, it is not. But you are still here, which means you have not walked out the door yet. He looked at her for a long moment. There was nothing agreeable in his expression. Only the face of a man who had followed someone he respected into territory he had not chosen, and was now taking careful account of exactly where he stood. He confirmed the order and left. She turned back to her reports. Morrow thought about Vessa's father. He had been one of the best kings the Ashkari had ever had, but he had not become that on the day of his coronation. He had become it over 30 years of learning and failing, and learning again, guided along the way by people who understood more than he did at the time. Morrow had been one of those people. She thought about Vesa, and then she set the thought aside, because there was no version of sitting with it that helped. On the third day, the neutral station appeared on the display, first as signals, then as structure, then as a cluster of lights resolving slowly into something real. We had been careful the entire way, avoiding main trade corridors, staying in the quiet spaces between busy routes. No sign of Voss's ships. Something settled in my chest as the station grew on the display. Not peace. Something more like purpose that has finally found its object. There is something I want to say before we reach the capital, I said, after the archive. But before everything else. Thank you is not enough, I said. I know that. I also know you are going to tell me it is more than enough and to stop worrying about the accounting. But I need you to know I am aware it is not enough, even if the word for why is not in my language. He thought about it for a long moment, the way he thought about things that mattered. Then he said, what I want, if I want anything, is for you to go back to that kingdom and be the kind of queen where people stay because they choose to. Use what you learned. That is the thing I would actually want. The Judiciary Archive occupied an inner section of the station, behind clearance checks that the archive's reputation for neutrality made feel more serious than most. Kellen Dre was reviewing documents when we were shown in. He looked up with the mild expression of a man who processes many things that turn out to be less significant than the person presenting them believes. Then he recognized me. The mild expression did not survive that. Your Majesty, he said very quietly, we received reports that you were killed in the initial attack. There is no time for the full account, I said. I was still wearing the clothes from before the coup. I had slept twice in 3 days. I looked nothing like a queen presenting herself at a formal institution. I did not have the luxury of caring. I need this archive to verify and release evidence that Regent Morrow issued an unlawful assassination order against me, exceeding her authority and violating every principle of legitimate succession. Dre's eyes moved to Dale. Dale set the recording device on the table and explained precisely and without editorializing how we had found it. Dre listened without interrupting. Then he listened to the recording. Then he listened again. This is significant, he said. If authenticated, it would fracture the Council's support immediately. Many who joined this transition genuinely believed it followed proper procedure.
Proof of an unauthorized assassination order changes everything. Then authenticate it, I said.
Release it.
Every moment we wait is another moment innocent people are defending a claim that was never lawfully earned. Whatever he found in my face, he made his decision.
He moved quickly. The verification process took 51 minutes. Dale stood near the door and watched the corridor. I stood near the console and watched the progress indicators. Neither of us spoke much. When the result came through, it was plain and final the way archive certifications always are. Authentic, beyond reasonable doubt. Dre released it through official channels, with the archive certification attached, and it moved. It moved fast, the way verified truth moves when people have been waiting for something solid to hold on to. Kellen Dre watched it go with the expression of someone who has just done something permanent. Within the first hour, reports came in. Loyalist factions emerging openly. Council members who had supported the coup going quiet in the way that means they are calculating their exits. Citizens amplifying the release with outrage that had been waiting for something concrete. Dale watched the incoming reports with the careful expression of someone who knows that good news in the middle of a crisis means the crisis is about to change shape rather than end. We did it, I said quietly. He kept watching the display. He did not say yes. I know you are watching for the other shoe, I said to Dale. He was quiet for a moment. She has been planning this for 6 months at minimum, he said. The coup itself was only the first layer. She would have planned for the recording. She would have planned for the archive. She would have planned for exactly this moment. And she is the most capable political mind in Ashkari space. I know, I said. which means we are not watching for the other shoe. We are watching for the moment she decides to drop it. The response kept building. 7 loyalist ship captains formally announced their support. 2 neutral systems issued recognition statements. Council members who had supported the coup were releasing careful statements noting they had been misled about the legality of the transition. For the first time since the attack, it genuinely seemed like the tide had turned. I let myself believe it, just for a moment. I let myself imagine going home. I had been wrong about many things in the last several days. I was wrong about this too. Morrow's voice came through on the emergency frequency, broadcast openly across every channel in the system. Measured, precise. Calm in the way that came from believing, she still controlled the outcome. People of the Ashkari, she said, the recording you have just heard is being used to destabilize a necessary transition of power. I am offering a simple resolution. The former queen is to present herself to the capital and publicly confirm her abdication. She has 6 hours. As proof of my sincerity, certain members of the royal household are being held as guests until this matter is resolved. Guests, I said. The word came out very flat. Kellen Dre had gone pale. Among the names in the contingency list she just read, he said quietly, is Hannah Varys. I had known that name since I was 4 years old. Hannah Varys was the head of the royal household staff. She had been there the night my father died. She had held my hand during the coronation when I could not stop shaking. She was not political. She had never been political. She just kept the palace running because it was her life's work. She picked someone she knew you cannot walk away from, Dale said. He was very still. That is not a coincidence. You are right, I said. I thought about Marrow's voice on the recording, the flat administrative language, the way she had described my assassination as a logistical problem. And now this. She believes she is on the right side, I said. That is the most dangerous thing about her. People who believe they are right do not know when to stop. His weapons array powered down completely. I request permission to accompany you to the capital, Voss said, and the formality of it, after everything, was the most unexpected thing I had heard in 3 days. There may be contingency elements of Morrow's plan I was not briefed on. I can help neutralize them. I have her operational notes from the last 6 months. I looked at Dale. He gave a slight nod. Permission granted, Commander, I said. Do not make me regret it. He did not promise that he would not. That was probably the right answer. We cannot stand down, Dale said. If you abdicate publicly, it validates everything she did. Every person who chose loyalty over self-interest gets abandoned. And Morrow learns that taking hostages works. That lesson will outlast this crisis by decades. Every leader after her who faces opposition will remember that it worked. I looked at him. You are right, I said. We go in anyway. Even if Voss is waiting. Even if the capital is full of her ships, we go, and we end this properly. Chapter 4, Capital. The journey to the capital was nothing like the returns I had imagined when I was young. No formal escort, no ceremonial approach, just the gray tide, running quiet and fast through back routes, with Dale monitoring 6 frequencies and me going over every detail of the palace layout I could remember. When the capital appeared on the display, first as signals and then as the familiar light configuration I had grown up knowing, I went on the open channel. This is Queen Vesa Threne, I said, and my voice was steadier than I felt. I am returning to reclaim my rightful throne. The evidence of Regent Morrow's unlawful actions has been certified by the Independent Judiciary Archive. What was done was not a legitimate succession. It was an assassination attempt by people who exceeded their authority and betrayed every principle they swore to uphold. I call on every loyal citizen, every honorable council member, and every person who has served this crown in good faith to stand now. I am alive. I am here, and I am not leaving. The capital came into view on the display as something more than a cluster of signal signatures. From the approach angle Dale had chosen, the full arc of the city was visible against the planet's terminator line, lit on one side and dark on the other. The palace structure at the center. I had grown up in it, and had never seen it from this distance before. It looked real from out here in a way it had not from inside it, which, I supposed, was what distance does to the things you have lived inside of. The long-range sensors showed movement in the city in patterns that were different from ordinary traffic. Groups forming in public spaces. Communications traffic spiking around the recording's release zones. People who had been waiting for the crisis to resolve were making choices about which resolution they intended to support. That is civilian organization, Dale said, watching the same display. They are not waiting to see what happens. They are trying to affect it. They know what it might cost them if the coup holds. He glanced at me. You asked what kind of queen you wanted to be. I think you already know. The defense perimeter display began to change. Ships that had been holding position started to move, and for one terrible second, I thought they were moving toward us. Then the formation resolved into something else, an escort configuration. A captain's voice came through identifying her vessel, stating that Loyalist forces had been waiting for confirmation of my survival since the recording was released. There are others, she said. There were. By the time we reached the upper atmosphere, 7 ships had joined around us, and more were signaling from further out. But Voss was there too. His flagship positioned between us and the main approach to the palace, weapon systems active, holding its position with the patience of a man who understood that the one who maintains their ground usually wins. He had not fired. He had not communicated. He was simply there between me and everything I needed to reach. Dale slowed the engines, and we stopped 3 kilometers out. What do you want to do? He asked quietly. I want to talk to him, I said. Open a direct channel. Dale opened the channel. 3 seconds of silence, and then Voss answered. He sounded exactly as I remembered him. Deep and measured, the voice of someone who had spent a lifetime making himself difficult to read. Your Majesty, he said. The title, despite everything. He still called me that. What do you want? Commander, I said. To understand, he said. I have reviewed the recording 3 times. I am having serious difficulty reconciling what I heard with the orders I have been following. Morrow told you this was necessary, I said. She believed it. I think she still believes it. And I think part of you believed it too, or you would not have followed the order. His silence confirmed it. She was wrong, I said. Not about the external threats. Those are real. She was wrong about the methods, and she was wrong about me.
Using the palace staff as hostages is not protecting the kingdom. It is proof that the line she crossed the moment she ordered. My assassination was only the first line, not the last.
The palace staff, Voss said, and something changed in his voice. A tightening. She told me the contingency was a formal detainment under emergency succession powers. She did not describe it as holding civilians without cause. I know, I said. She has a way of framing things that makes them sound more legal than they are. She has had 35 years to develop that skill. He was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was different. What do you need from me? He said. I need you to stand down, I said. And I need you to trust that when this is over, the people who followed orders they believed were lawful will be treated differently from the people who gave those orders. You are a soldier who was deceived by a superior you trusted. That is a different thing from being a traitor. Another silence. Longer. Then his display indicators shifted, weapon systems from active to standby. I am going to let you pass, he said. I want Morrow's formal hearing under proper law. You have my word, I said. And I meant it. The paintings I had grown up with were still on the walls. The formal portraits, the historical commissions, the pieces acquired over 3 successive reigns. None of them had been touched. The kings and advisors and ceremonial figures looking down from the walls had all presided over their own crises. The palace had been through things before. It was still here. I was still here. The work was figuring out what here meant going forward. We landed on the ceremonial platform at the base of the palace. The ship settled with a final metallic sigh and went quiet. Palace guards who had been uncertain which way to stand were now kneeling, because the broadcast and the Loyalist escort and Voss's flagship in formation beside us had answered the question of which side would prevail. I walked toward the palace entrance. I heard Dale's footsteps behind me. There was not a person alive who would have predicted this was how I came home. Dale was looking at the portraits, too. Anyone you know up there? He asked eventually. My father is at the end of the corridor, I said. The most recent portrait. Painted when he was 50, and he hated sitting for it. Dale looked for a moment. He was wearing something formal that did not suit him, he said. Yes, I said. He always said the formal clothes made him look like he was pretending to be himself. He used to say the only time he felt like a real king was when nobody was watching. Dale laughed at that. That is how you know someone was actually a good king, he said. The household staff, who had stayed, were the ones I stopped to observe most carefully as we moved through the corridors. The people who had been doing their ordinary work under uncertain authority, because their jobs existed, regardless of who controlled the building. One of them, a woman I recognized from 100 childhood breakfasts, looked up from a cart she was pushing and said simply, "Welcome home, Your Majesty." Something in my chest moved. I had not expected that. I had expected relief. I had not expected it to feel like exactly the right thing, said by exactly the right person. The palace had not changed and was entirely different. Every corridor exactly as I had known it. Every stone surface the same. But the quiet was a different kind of quiet. Not the busy, purposeful quiet of a functioning court managing its daily business. The careful quiet of a place that had been holding its breath. 2 formal rooms we passed had their doors sealed with the temporary markings that meant they had been repurposed under the coup. I noted them without stopping. There was an enormous amount of work to do. That was fine. Work I could do. We heard Morrow before we reached the throne room. Her voice through the closed doors, precise and authoritative, giving instructions in the same tone she had used in council sessions for 20 years. Still managing. Still in control of the room she was in. The guards at the throne room door made their decision when they saw me coming, and they made it quickly. One stepped aside. The other opened the door, and I walked into the room that was supposed to be mine. The throne room was lit the way it was always lit, carefully, with the light calibrated to make the Suetian artifacts catch and hold attention. Morrow was standing near the throne. 2 council members flanked her, though they were already beginning to drift toward the far edge of the room in the careful way of people who are trying to have not been standing where they were standing. A household official stood to one side with a document. The ceremony had clearly been interrupted mid-preparation. Then she saw me, not panic. What crossed her face was more complicated. A compression, like a building settling under unexpected weight, finding its new configuration.
She had planned for many possibilities over many years. She was now determining which one had arrived.
"Your Majesty," she said, her voice unchanged, measured, the same voice from the recording now addressing its subject directly. I took 3 steps toward her and stopped. I wanted to look at her clearly. I wanted her to see that I was looking clearly. "You will answer for what you have done," I said. "Not only for what you attempted against me, for every person placed in danger by this, for every soldier asked to follow an unlawful order because they trusted your authority, for Hannah Varys and every member of this household you held as leverage, for every ordinary citizen whose life was disrupted by a crisis you manufactured." I paused, and I want you to hear me say this clearly. I understand your reasoning. I understand your fear for this kingdom. You were still wrong. "I am not wrong about the threats," she said. Her voice was steady. Still entirely herself, even now. "The 3 empires positioning at our borders are real. The trade route shifts are real. You have been queen for 8 days total, Vesa. I have spent 35 years watching this kingdom nearly break and holding it together." I met her eyes. "Tell me one true thing," I said. "Not a justification, not a rationale. Just the truth of what you actually believe." She was still for a long moment. "You spent 35 years serving this crown," I said. "That is real. The work you did for my grandfather and my father was real, and it mattered. I am not going to pretend none of that happened because of what you did this week. It all happened. The question is what the next chapter looks like. For you and for this kingdom." She looked at me for a long moment. Then quietly she said, "I hope you are right about what you can become." "That is the most honest thing you have said since I walked in," I told her. "I am afraid," she said. "Genuinely afraid. Not the managed concern of a political position. The actual fear of someone who has spent 35 years watching events accumulate toward an outcome that most people have not noticed yet. I believe the threats are real, and I believe this kingdom is not ready for them. And I believe a 20-year-old queen who has been on the throne for 8 days cannot lead us through what is coming." I looked at her. "I believe that fear is real," I said, "and that is exactly why what you did makes no sense. You cannot build a kingdom capable of surviving what is coming on a foundation of fear and manufactured authority," I said. "The people who have to face what is coming alongside me need to trust that the person asking for their courage is worth trusting. You cannot manufacture that. You cannot create it by removing the alternative. It has to be earned. I think part of you knows that. I think that is what you were actually afraid of. Not that I could not learn, but that I might." She met my eyes. "You are your father's daughter, after all," she said. Not as a concession. As a fact she had just confirmed. Then she turned to the official beside her. "The household staff are in the East receiving room," she said. "They are unharmed. Release them now." The official moved immediately. I had not needed a standoff after all. She had already made her decision in the moment she saw me walk through that door. Some endings do not look like what you expect. "I did not intend to harm this kingdom," she said as the guards reached her. "I have only ever intended to protect it." She was standing very straight. "I believe you," I said. "And the fact that you believe it too is the most important thing for you to think about in the time ahead." Voss appeared at the throne room door while the guards were completing the arrest. He had walked through the palace without ceremony, carrying himself in the way of a person who has accepted the cost of a decision they know will change things permanently. He looked at Morrow as the guards led her past him. She looked back. Something passed between them I did not have the right to read. Then she was gone and he was looking at me. "I served your father for 9 years," he said. "He deserved better from me than what I gave his daughter this week. Whatever the hearing decides, that part I will have to live with." "I know," I said. "I am glad you are here." The council members in the room with her were secured for questioning. Their involvement had been performative rather than committed. They had calculated Morrow's odds as favorable and found those odds suddenly and completely revised. Voss's formal surrender came through an hour later, clean and written, with a statement requesting that his cooperation be noted. I made sure it was. He had made an impossible choice in the moment that mattered, and I would not pretend that counted for nothing. The immediate aftermath was a series of tasks that needed to happen in a specific order. Household staff released and accounted for. Council members in the throne room formally informed of the charges they would face. An official communication drafted and released to every allied and neutral system. Kellen Dre's certification formally logged in the palace records. Each task took exactly as long as it took. Dale sat on a bench near the wall and watched it all happen. He did not offer to help because he understood instinctively that this particular work was not his to help with. There was a moment, perhaps an hour into the aftermath, when everything that needed to happen in the next hour had a person assigned to it and was in motion. I stood in the center of the throne room, with nothing immediately requiring my action. Dale looked up from the bench when I crossed toward him. He read something in my face before I said anything. "It is done," he said. Not as a question. "It is done," I confirmed. He stood up. He did not say anything else. He did not have to. I was beginning to understand that was going to be a regular feature of whatever came next. Hannah Varys was brought to me within 20 minutes of Morrow giving the release order. She looked at me the way she had looked at me the night my father died, with the expression of someone who had prepared for the worst and was now recalibrating. "They told us you had been killed," she said. "I know," I said. "I am sorry it took this long." She looked at me for another moment, then she said, "Your father would have been very proud of you." And I had to look away, because there are certain things you can hold together only so long before they require their moment. Chapter 5. What comes next? The business of restoring a throne is not romantic.
Nobody tells you
That when you are young and learning what a crown means. The stories focus on the battles and the betrayals and the moment of return. They do not mention the paperwork. In the days that followed, I sat through more formal proceedings than I had in 3 years before the coup. Council members interviewed. Testimony recorded. Evidence submitted. The work was not dramatic. It was just work, and it needed to be done correctly. Morrow's formal hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks out, which she was entitled to under the same laws she had violated. I would not bypass that process regardless of how clearly her guilt had been established. Whatever came next had to be built on the fact that the proper process had been followed, that the outcome was legitimate, that the difference between what she had done and what I was doing was not merely about who had won. That difference was the entire point. I had learned enough to know that. The first council meeting after the restoration was 18 people, 7 of whom had some degree of involvement in the coup, 4 of whom had maintained formal neutrality while quietly supporting Morrow's side, and 3 of whom had actively resisted. I conducted the meeting without emphasizing who had done what, because the meeting was about governance, and governance was what mattered now. But I noted everything. Somewhere in 6 days of crisis, I had become better at reading the difference between what someone said and what they meant. That was going to be useful. On the first afternoon, I found Dale fixing a coolant valve in the East Wing utility corridor. Not because he had been asked. Not because there was a maintenance issue he had been assigned. Because he had noticed the valve was running inconsistent on his way from his rooms to the main wing and had taken out the appropriate tool from the kit he apparently carried everywhere as a matter of habit, and was addressing the problem that was in front of him. He looked up when he heard me coming. It needed doing, he said. I know, I said. That is why I came to find you. He almost smiled. Voss's military hearing was more complicated. 23 years of honorable service to my father's crown sat on one side of the scale. 4 days of pursuit of the queen he had sworn to protect sat on the other. His decision at the orbital perimeter, the moment he stood down when it would have been easier not to, was in the record. I left the determination to the appropriate court. Whatever else the next years required of me, they required trusting the process rather than controlling the outcome. That was harder than it sounded. It was also the point. On the second day, I drafted a formal letter to Dale's last registered port of record, notifying them that his ship, the Grey Tide, had performed a service of exceptional merit
To the crown of the Ashkari, and that any outstanding docking fees or inspection delays associated with that vessel were hereby considered cleared.
It was a small thing. He would tell me it was unnecessary. I sent it anyway. Not because it closed a debt. Because it was the right thing to do for someone who had been away from his work for longer than he had planned, doing something that had cost him real time and real money. That was the kind of accounting I was starting to understand. Kellandre sent a formal message from the Judiciary Archive, noting that the certification had attracted significant interest from legal scholars across multiple jurisdictions. He mentioned, with the dry precision of someone who understood exactly what he was saying, that the case represented the first documented instance in Ashkari history of an assassination attempt on a sitting sovereign being legally certified as unlawful through independent archive verification. He seemed pleased with that sentence. I thought he had earned the right to be. Dale watched all of this from a careful distance. He had been given rooms in the East Wing and had cleaned them himself before anyone could be assigned to do it, which was so entirely in character that when the household staff mentioned it, I almost smiled. He attended the meals I asked him to attend and stood where I suggested during formal proceedings and was courteous to every official who passed through. But he stood at the edges of things, not excluded, simply positioned where he had quietly decided he belonged. I found him on the east balcony on the afternoon of the third day, during a recess in a long session with council members competing to demonstrate how thoroughly they had opposed the coup while technically having supported it. He was leaning on the railing, looking at the palace gardens. "You look uncomfortable," I said. "I was trying not to be obvious about it," he said. "You were not obvious," I said. "I have just become reasonably good at reading you." He looked at the gardens. "It is not a bad place," he said, "meaning all of it, just not designed with people like me in mind. People without a formal role in any of this," he said, without self-pity. "Just observation, you have real work ahead of you. Systems to stabilize, a council to rebuild. That work has specific people designed for it." I leaned on the railing beside him, close enough that we were looking at the same section of garden. "You are wrong," I said. He looked at me. "About there being no place for you here," I said. He was quiet for a moment, sitting with it the way he sat with things that needed thought rather than reaction. "I am not asking you to stay because I owe you a debt," I said. "I stopped thinking about it in those terms somewhere around the second day on your ship. I am asking you to stay because I want you to, because I have spent 20 years surrounded by people who were present because they had calculated that being present was advantageous. I find that I have no interest in going back to that. I have spent the last several days with someone who was present because he decided that leaving was not something he was willing to do," I said, "and I find I am not interested in returning to the first kind of company." I finished saying it and looked at the garden and waited. Dale was quiet for a long moment. Something opened in his expression, a small thing internal, a door rather than a gesture. He did not say anything, but he stayed at the railing, and the staying was the answer. The formal restoration ceremony was held on the 5th day in the main hall of the palace, attended by representatives from every loyal system across Ashkari space and several neutral systems who sent observation delegations once the coup's collapse was confirmed. I went through it carefully and without rushing. because it mattered that it was done correctly.
Every element was a statement about legitimacy, about continuity, about the difference between power taken and power properly held.
I did not let my attention drift once. Before the ceremony, Hannah Vera spent an hour in the formal preparation rooms, making sure every detail was correct. She managed it now with the same focused calm she brought to everything, as if the 8 days of crisis had been a brief interruption in an ordinary workday. When I was ready, she looked at me in the way she had looked at me on the morning of the coronation. Then she said simply, "Good, you are ready," and she stepped aside. I had been waiting my entire life to be ready. I went. Near the end of the ceremony, when the formal portions were complete, I turned toward the back of the hall, where Dale was standing near the exit, with the expression of someone composing themselves to endure something. "This man," I said, and every eye in the room followed my gesture, answered a distress signal when every other vessel in range chose not to. He crossed 3 systems in a salvage hauler, conducted a rescue under fire, evaded pursuit through an asteroid belt, intercepted the evidence that proved this coup's illegitimacy, and accompanied me back here. He did all of this guided by nothing more than the belief that helping someone in danger was the right thing to do, regardless of personal cost. He refused payment every time I offered it," I continued. "He told me, more than once, that he had not done any of it to be repaid. I believe him completely, which is precisely why I intend to do this. I am departing from traditional form. The right of life debt exists to acknowledge when a life is saved and to establish a repayment that closes the obligation. That framework does not accurately describe what happened between me and Dale Osai. What he gave me cannot be repaid. It exists outside that structure entirely. So I am creating a new title," I said, "one that has never existed before in Ashkari history. Dale Osai is hereby declared consort of the dead eternal, not a debt to be repaid, not an obligation to be discharged, an acknowledgement of genuine kindness that cannot be measured by any scale we currently possess. I am marking it permanently, because such things deserve to be marked permanently." The hall was very still for a long moment. Then acknowledgement began to move through the assembled representatives, not unanimous, not immediate, but genuine. I had been preparing for this ceremony my entire life, in the sense that every lesson and protocol and formal occasion had been preparing me for the weight of standing in that hall and meaning every word of it, and yet nothing had prepared me for the particular quality of the silence after I said his name. The hall held it. The way a room holds a sound that has changed the air. Dale Osai stood at the back of the hall, looking like someone who had not planned for today and was receiving it anyway. And I thought that was exactly right. The most important things rarely arrive on schedule. The hall was very still for a long moment after I said it. Then acknowledgement began to move through the assembled representatives. Not unanimous, not immediate, but genuine. The measured recognition of people who understood they were witnessing something significant, even if most of them would need time to work through what it meant for succession law. Sura, standing near the side of the hall, had the expression of someone watching an institution discover it is more flexible than it appeared. She was already writing. She had been waiting for something like this for a very long time. After the ceremony, I found Dale near the door to the east corridor. "You did not have to do that," he said very quietly. "I know," I said. "That is exactly why I did it." He looked at me. "Consort of the dead eternal," he said. "Sura tells me the legal implications are somewhat complex and will require a formal annotation to the succession records," I said. She seemed genuinely energized by the challenge. I believe she has been hoping for something new to categorize for quite some time. Something in his expression loosened. "I still do not want your ring," he said. "I know," I said. "I gave up on the ring 37 hours into the asteroid belt." He almost laughed. We ended up on the east balcony again that evening, as the sun dropped behind the city skyline in the slow, deliberate way it does at this time of year. The garden lights were on below, steady in the warm dark. "I still cannot stop wanting to say thank you," I said, "even now with everything done." "You can say it," Dale said. "I stopped arguing with you about that a while ago." "Somewhere around which day?" I asked. "Second day in the asteroid belt," he said. "When you told me you did not have a framework for kindness that asked for nothing. I realized telling you to stop was getting in the way of you understanding something important." "There is something I have been trying to find the words for," I said. "Something I wanted to say without it sounding like an obligation or a transaction." He waited, the way he always waited, without impatience, without filling the space. I am glad you answered, I said. Not because of what happened after, not because of what it meant for the kingdom. Just that, I am glad your hand went to the control, and you turned toward my signal, and I am glad I got to meet the person who does that. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, I am glad too, exactly that simply, and it was enough. You showed me what genuine kindness looks like, I said. My entire upbringing failed to do that, not because everyone around me was cruel, but they had all made the same agreement about what the world was and how it worked, and none of them had reason to question it. You had a different agreement. One your mother gave you in a colony most people in this palace have never heard of, under circumstances that by any formal measure were worse than anything I have faced. And you kept it even when it was inconvenient, especially when it was inconvenient. You know, Dale said, you taught me something too. What could I possibly have taught you? I asked. That sometimes the person being saved is not actually the one in the harder position, he said. You had everything taken from you, your throne, your safety, your fleet, the father you had not finished grieving. And in the middle of all of that, you were still capable of asking about my mother, of being curious about where I came from, of trying to understand a different way of seeing things, even while your own life was actively in danger. That is not a small thing. I had a great deal of sitting in an asteroid belt time, I said. It focused the attention. Maybe, he said. But I think you were always going to be the kind of person who paid attention. You just had not been in a situation that required it honestly rather than strategically before. I thought about that, about who I had been 3 days before the coup, about how much of my attention had been genuinely present, and how much had been performing presence while doing something else underneath. I think that may be true, I said. The last of the sun went behind the skyline. The evenings settled around us in the way evenings do in a city that is returning to itself. The sounds of ordinary life resuming, the particular quality of light that comes when a place has been through something, and the people in it have decided, collectively and quietly, to keep going. I thought about all the evenings I had spent on this balcony over the years, never stopping to simply be in them. I had always been moving between one formal function and the next. I had not stood here and looked at nothing in particular and felt that nothing in particular was enough. Thank you, I said, one final time, meaning nothing more and nothing less than the words themselves. No weight of obligation, no calculation about what they might generate, just the simple truth of it, offered plainly, with no expectation of anything in return. Dale reached out and took my hand. Among traditional Ashkari formal standards, this was a significant breach of protocol. I was entirely aware of this. I found that I did not care, which was itself the clearest evidence yet of how much had changed in me. His hand was warm and calloused and steady, exactly itself in the way everything about him was exactly itself. You are welcome, he said. Now let us figure out what comes next. I looked out over the garden, over the palace I had nearly lost, over a city settling back into something like its ordinary shape, and I understood what the most important thing I had learned through all of it actually was. It was not about strategy or survival or reclaiming what had been taken. There is something I wanted to say, I said. We were on the balcony the evening before the ceremony, without it sounding like an obligation or a transaction. He waited without impatience, without filling the space. You answered a distress signal, I said. You turned your ship toward a dying person when every calculation said you should not. And I need you to know that I understand what that actually was. Not what my language has a word for, what it actually was. He was quiet. Tell me, he said. Kindness, I said. The real kind. Given because it was right, not because of anything it would generate. He looked at the garden. Yeah, he said, that is what it was. When I turned the ship toward your signal, he said, I did not know who you were. I did not know you were a queen, or that there was a coup, or that this would become any of what it became. I only knew someone was dying, and I was close enough to help. Everything after that was just the rest of it. I looked at him.
Is that supposed to make it smaller?
I asked. No, he said. I think it makes it larger, because it means it was never about what I thought I would get. It was just about what I thought was right. He paused. That is the only reason anything I did matters. It was that kindness given freely, without expectation, without calculation, without any accounting of return, had the power to change the shape of a person. It had certainly changed mine. I held his hand and watched the garden lights hold steady in the dark, and thought about what comes next with something I had not had much practice feeling. Hope given freely. Nothing owed, nothing required in return. Simply true. The end.